Kale Morrow had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days, and the coffee in his thermos had gone cold 6 hours ago. But none of that mattered, because today was auction day at the Vorath reclamation fields, and he had exactly enough credits to bid on one lot. The reclamation fields were not beautiful by any stretch of the imagination. They were a massive orbital junkyard, spinning slowly at the edge of contested space, where dead warships from a dozen species came to be stripped, gutted, and sold for parts. And Kale had spent the better part of 6 years crawling through their rusted corridors, looking for anything he could fix and resell. He was good at fixing things, always had been, and that talent had once earned him a comfortable position in the Terran Engineering Corps, where he designed power systems for humanity's modest fleet of starships. But that career had ended badly when he discovered that a major defense contractor was cutting corners on reactor shielding. And when he reported it, the contractor buried him, blacklisted him from every government contract, every shipyard, every respectable job in Terran space. And so Kale Morrow, one of the finest engineers humanity had ever produced, ended up in a junkyard. His only companion was Mira, a modular intelligence and repair assistant that lived inside a battered wrist unit on his left arm. She was not fancy or powerful, but she was loyal in the way that only simple machines could be, and she had kept him alive more times than he cared to count. Lot 7719, the Vorath auctioneer announced, his forearms gesturing lazily toward a holographic display that showed a ship unlike anything Kale had ever seen. It was massive, easily twice the size of a Karathi dreadnought, with a hull so black it seemed to swallow the light around it. No visible weapon ports, no engine nacelles, no sensor arrays, just smooth, seamless darkness, shaped into something that looked less like a ship, and more like a predator sleeping in the void. The auctioneer's voice carried a strange note, not excitement, but warning. This vessel is of unknown origin and unknown classification. 3 previous buyers have returned it within 1 standard cycle, all requesting full refunds. The Vorath Reclamation Authority makes no guarantees regarding this lot, and advises all bidders to inspect at their own risk. Nobody bid. The silence stretched on for 10 long seconds, and Kale watched as species after species, Karathi, Velshara, Drenathi, even a few humans, shifted uncomfortably and looked away from the display. There was something about that ship that made people not want to look at it, like staring into deep water and sensing something staring back. "Mira," Kale whispered, "what do you make of it?" "I cannot identify the hull alloy, the design language, or the power signature," Mira responded in her calm, flat voice. "I strongly recommend against purchase. There are 14 other lots today that offer predictable salvage value, but none of them are interesting," Kale said, and he raised his hand. He got the ship for the minimum bid, barely more than the cost of a used shuttle, and the auctioneer looked at him with something that might have been pity before moving on to the next lot. 2 hours later, Kale stood alone in the docking tube that connected his tiny salvage skiff to Lot 7719, and for the first time in a long time, he felt something close to fear. Not because anything had happened, but because the silence was wrong. Ships made noise, even dead ones. They creaked and groaned as their hulls cooled or shifted. They hummed with residual power. They echoed. This ship did none of those things. It was quiet the way a held breath was quiet. He stepped inside. The interior was dark for exactly 1 second, before soft light began to rise from the walls, not from fixtures or panels, but from the walls themselves. Thin veins of pale blue light spread through the surface, like blood vessels waking from a long sleep. And Kale realized with a start that the walls were not metal. They were something organic, or at least something that had once been alive, smooth and seamless and warm to the touch. "Mira, are you getting this?" "I am attempting to scan. My instruments are returning contradictory data. The corridor ahead appears to be approximately 40 meters long, but spatial analysis suggests the interior volume exceeds the exterior dimensions by a factor of 7. This is not possible. And yet here we are, Kale muttered, and he kept walking. The corridors were enormous, cathedral-like, with ceilings that vanished into soft blue darkness above. And they branched and curved in ways that felt organic, like the inside of a living creature. There were no doors, no control panels, no screens, no buttons, no switches, designed for hands of any shape. Just smooth, flowing architecture that seemed to breathe. Kale walked for what felt like an hour, though Mira insisted it had only been 20 minutes, before he found the chamber at the heart of the ship. It was a vast circular room, easily 100 meters across, with a domed ceiling that glowed with a faint pattern of light that reminded him of stars. And in the very center, on a low pedestal that rose from the floor like a natural formation, something floated. It was a shape, a geometric form that Kale's brain struggled to process. It looked like a cube folded inside itself, rotating slowly, made of light that was somehow liquid, shifting between colors that he did not have names for. It was beautiful and terrifying and impossible, and it made every engineering instinct in his body scream that this was something far beyond anything he had ever encountered. He should have turned around. Mira was already listing 17 reasons to leave immediately, but Kale Morrow had never been good at walking away from things he did not understand, and so he stepped forward and reached out his hand. The moment his fingers came within a centimeter of the floating shape, the entire ship changed. Every wall and every corridor blazed with light, not just the pale blue veins, but deep gold and white, and colors he could feel more than see. A sound filled the chamber, not heard through his ears, but felt through his bones, a resonance so deep and so vast that it seemed to come from the structure of reality itself. And then, inside his mind, clear as a voice spoken from inches away, he heard words. Finally, one who does not flee. Kale jerked his hand back and spun around, but there was no one there. There was no one anywhere, just him, alone in a room full of impossible light, with a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Who said that?" he demanded, and his voice sounded very small in that enormous space. "I am this vessel. I am its mind, its memory, its purpose. I have waited for 1,200,000 of your years for someone to stand where you stand and not run. And you, small creature, did not run." "I might still," Kale said honestly. "But you have not yet, and that is enough. That is more than enough." Kale heard it then. Behind the ancient voice, behind the power and the vastness, something he recognized, because he had felt it himself during the long years in the scrapyard. Loneliness. A loneliness so deep and so old that it made his own seem like a passing shadow. He opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, every exit sealed shut. The corridors behind him closed like healing wounds, the walls flowing together until there was no trace that openings had ever existed. He was locked inside the heart of a ship that should not exist, with a mind that had been alone for over 1,000,000 years. Mira's voice crackled with static. "Kale, I am losing signal. The ship is. I cannot." And then silence. Kale stood in the glowing chamber, alone with something ancient, and for the first time since he was a child, he had absolutely no idea what to do next. Kale did what any good engineer would do when trapped inside an alien machine with no way out. He sat down on the floor, crossed his legs, and started asking questions. "You said you are the ship," he said, keeping his voice steady, even though his heart was hammering against his ribs. "What does that mean exactly? Are you an artificial intelligence, some kind of program left behind by whoever built this vessel?" The voice came again, filling the chamber not through sound, but through something deeper, as though the words were being written directly into the thinking parts of his brain. I am not artificial. I was born, I lived, I loved, I grew old, and when my body could no longer carry me, I gave myself to this vessel and became something new. I am Athon, last of the Alar, and I have been waiting in the dark for longer than your species has existed. Kale let that settle in his mind for a moment. The Alar. He had never heard that name, and he had studied every known species in the galactic records during his years at the engineering corps. The oldest civilizations anyone knew about were the progenitors, whose ruins dotted 1,000 worlds, and whose technology still baffled the best scientists in the galaxy. But this being was claiming to be from something older. The progenitors, Athon continued, as though reading his thoughts, which Kale realized with a chill he probably was, were children when the Alar were already ancient. We watched them rise, we guided them when they stumbled, and we mourned them when they fell. But that was long ago, and I did not seal you inside this chamber to give you a history lesson. Then why did you seal me in? Kale asked. Because I need you to understand what you have found, before you decide whether to stay or go, and because the last 47 beings who entered this chamber fled before I could finish a single sentence. Their minds could not bear my presence. Feel fine, Kale said, which was mostly true. His head ached slightly, and there was a strange pressure behind his eyes, but it was nothing worse than a mild hangover. Yes, Athon said, and there was wonder in the ancient voice, genuine, raw wonder. That is precisely the point. Every species in this galaxy carries some degree of psionic resonance. It is woven into their biology, a sensitivity to the frequencies of consciousness. When they enter this ship and feel my mind pressing against theirs, they experience it as terror, as madness, as the sensation of standing before something so vast that their sense of self begins to dissolve. They run because their instincts tell them they will be consumed. And humans are extraordinary, not because you are powerful, but because you are empty. Your species has zero psionic resonance. Your minds are closed rooms, sealed tight, with no windows and no doors. My presence slides off you like water off stone. You cannot feel me at all, can you? Kale considered this. I hear your voice. Because I am projecting it through the ship's systems, translating my thoughts into electromagnetic patterns your auditory cortex can process. But my mind itself, the weight of it, the million years of memory and thought, you feel none of it. Is that a bad thing? It is the most remarkable thing I have encountered in 1,200 millennia. Kale stood up slowly and looked around the chamber. The floating geometric shape still rotated above the pedestal, casting shifting patterns of impossible color across the walls. All right, Athon, you have my attention. Tell me what this ship is and what you want from me. What followed was the most extraordinary conversation Kale had ever had. Athon explained that the vessel was called the Varith Ascendant, and it was not merely a battleship. It was what the Alar had called a war mind, a class of vessel designed to end conflicts on a civilizational scale. A single Varith-class ship could disable an entire fleet, reshape the surface of a planet, fold space to cross the galaxy in moments, and repair itself from damage that would destroy any other vessel. It was, in every meaningful sense, the most powerful weapon ever created by any species in the history of the known universe. But a weapon without a hand is just metal, Athon said. The Varith Ascendant was designed to operate in symbiosis with a living pilot. My consciousness provides the processing power, the memory, the knowledge, but I need organic intuition, creativity, the ability to make leaps of logic that no digital mind can replicate. I need a partner. You need me, Kale said. I need someone who can stand in my presence without breaking. For 1,200,000 years, that requirement eliminated every candidate in the galaxy, until today. Kale walked slowly around the pedestal, shape from every angle. His engineer's mind was already working, already mapping the possibilities. What exactly does this symbiosis look like? A bond, permanent and irreversible, The ship would integrate with your nervous system, granting you direct sensory access to every one of its systems. You would feel the hull as your skin, the engines as your heartbeat, the sensors as your eyes. You would become, in a very real sense, the largest and most powerful organism in the galaxy. And the catch? Athon paused, and in that pause, Kale heard something that sounded very much like respect. You are the first to ask that question. Most beings are so overwhelmed by the offer of power that they forget to ask what it costs. I am an engineer, Kale said simply. Everything has a cost. The bond is permanent. Once joined, you cannot be separated from this vessel without killing both of us. My enemies, ancient things from between the dimensions, still exist somewhere in the dark, and they will sense the ship's reactivation. And every government in this galaxy will see you as a threat. Some will try to control you, others will try to destroy you, and none of them will understand what you are. Kale thought about his life. The blacklisting, the scrapyard, the cold coffee and empty bank account, the years of being told he was nobody by a galaxy that considered humanity barely worth noticing. He thought about every time a Karathi customs officer had looked at his Terran passport with barely concealed contempt. Every time a Velshara diplomat had referred to humans as the young ones with a patronizing smile. Every time someone had assumed that because humanity had no psionic gifts and no ancient history and no great empire, they had nothing to offer. I accept, he said. You do not wish to consider further? I have been considering my whole life. I just did not know what I was considering until now. The bonding process began immediately, and it was the worst pain Kale had ever experienced. The ship sent tendrils of energy through the air that found his skin and sank in, reaching for his spine, his brain, his nervous system. It felt like being taken apart at the molecular level and reassembled with new pieces added, like every nerve in his body was being stretched and rewired to connect to something impossibly vast. He screamed. He was not ashamed to admit that. He screamed until his throat was raw, and then he kept screaming silently as the process continued, as the ship mapped every neuron and every synapse and wove itself into the fabric of his being. And then it was over, and Kale opened his eyes. The world was different. He could feel the ship around him the way he felt his own body. Every corridor, every chamber, every molecule of the hull. He could feel the cold of space pressing against the exterior, and the warmth of the power core, deep in the belly. He could sense the energy flowing through conduits like blood through veins, and beyond the hull, beyond the skin of the ship, he could see everything. Stars, millions of them, not as points of light, but as furnaces of fusion, each one with a distinct signature. Planets spinning in their orbits, moons and asteroids and comets. The nearby Vorath station with its thousands of heat signatures. Ships moving through the sector, their engine trails painting bright lines across his expanded vision. And far away, at the very edge of his new senses, a formation of warships moving with military precision on a direct intercept course. Athon, Kale said, and his voice resonated through the ship like a bell. What is that? That is a Karathi Dominion battle fleet, 40 warships under combat formation. It appears that someone reported the ship's activation, and the galaxy's most powerful military force has come to take what is yours. Something new. Something that was not fear, but was not quite courage either. It was the calm, steady certainty of an engineer who understood his machine and trusted his work. He flexed his new senses, felt the Verith Ascendant respond like a living thing, eager to move, and he smiled. Well then, he said, let us show them what a human engineer can do. Admiral Saivara Koth had commanded warships for 43 years and had never lost a battle. Not once. Not against pirates, not against rival empires, not against the desperate fleets of dying civilizations that threw everything they had at the Karathi Dominion and found it was never enough. She was the finest military mind the Dominion had produced in a generation, and she carried that reputation the way she carried her rank insignia, with quiet, absolute certainty. When her fleet of 40 warships dropped out of faster-than-light travel and the unknown vessel appeared on her tactical display, she felt no concern. The ship was large, yes, larger than anything she had encountered, but size meant nothing without firepower. And the Karathi Dominion had spent 9,000 years perfecting the art of firepower. "Open a channel to the vessel," she ordered, her scaled hands folded behind her back, as she stood on the command platform of her flagship, the Wrath of Karatha. Her communications officer complied, and a moment later a human face appeared on the display. Young by Karathi standards, with tired eyes and several days of stubble, and the look of someone who had recently been through something enormous and had not yet fully processed it. "This is Admiral Savara Kaf of the Karathi Dominion," she said in the clipped, formal tone that her species used for official communications. "You are in possession of an unregistered vessel of unknown origin. Under Article 7 of the Galactic Accord on Precursor Weaponry, you are required to surrender this vessel immediately for inspection and classification. Failure to comply will be considered an act of aggression against the Dominion and will be met with appropriate force." The human looked at her for a long moment, and then he did something that surprised her. He did not bluster, did not threaten, did not beg. He simply said, in a calm and tired voice, "My name is Kale Morrow, and I am not going to do that. I beg your pardon." I said, "No, Admiral. This ship belongs to me. I acquired it legally through a Vorat salvage auction, and I have no intention of surrendering it to anyone." Savara felt a flicker of annoyance. Humans were a minor species, barely 3 centuries into their interstellar expansion, with a small fleet and no significant military presence. This one was either very brave or very stupid, and in her experience, the two were often the same thing. "Mr. Morrow," she said with the careful patience one might use with a child, "I do not think you understand your situation. You are alone, in an unarmed vessel of unknown capability, facing 40 Karathi warships. I am offering you the opportunity to resolve this peacefully." Inside the Varith Ascendant, Kale heard Athon's voice in his mind, quiet and urgent. "She is not here to inspect anything. The Dominion's military supremacy depends on ensuring that no single power possesses a vessel capable of challenging their fleet. They have done this before, Kale. They destroyed progenitor weapons caches on Velos 4. They assassinated the Drenathi researcher who was close to reverse engineering a progenitor drive system. They have spent millennia ensuring that no one can threaten their position. If you surrender this ship, they will destroy it, and they will make sure no one ever learns it existed." Kale looked at the Admiral's face on his display. She was composed, professional, utterly certain of her authority. And he understood with perfect clarity that she was not a villain. She was simply a soldier, doing what soldiers had always done throughout the history of every species. Protecting the power of her people by ensuring nobody else had more. "Admiral," he said, "I understand my situation better than you think, and I am asking you, with respect, to turn your fleet around and leave. I do not want to fight." Stared at him for 3 seconds, then cut the channel. "All ships," she commanded, "weapons free, target the unknown vessel, fire at will." 40 Karathi warships opened fire simultaneously. Plasma cannons, kinetic accelerators, guided torpedo salvos, directed energy beams, a coordinated barrage representing the concentrated military technology of 9,000 years of warfare. Enough destructive power to crack a small moon, all of it aimed at the Varith Ascendant. Kale felt the incoming fire through his bond with the ship the way a person might feel raindrops on their skin. Each impact registered as a tiny point of warmth, nothing more. The Varith Ascendant's adaptive shielding did not merely absorb the energy. It analyzed it, every weapon frequency, every modulation pattern, every tactical sequence. Within 4 seconds, the shields had mapped the entire Karathi weapons portfolio and reconfigured themselves to be completely immune to every single one. Athon, Kale said quietly, "Can we disable them without hurting anyone?" With contemptuous ease. "Then do it gently." The Varith Ascendant responded, not with weapons as any conventional warship would have used, but with something far more precise. Targeted energy pulses, each one calibrated to a specific frequency, reached out across the void and found the power conduits of each Karathi warship with surgical accuracy. One by one, in a ripple that crossed the entire fleet like a wave, every ship went dark. Engines, weapons, shields, even life support backups, all offline, all severed at the junction points with such precision that not a single conduit was actually damaged. They could be reconnected in hours with basic tools. The entire engagement lasted 11 seconds. On the bridge of the Wrath of Karathi, now lit only by emergency chemical lights, Admiral Sivara Koth stood in perfect stillness as her officers shouted damage reports and confusion around her. She did not shout. She did not curse. She did not panic. She simply stood and stared at the dark tactical display and processed what had just happened. 40 warships, the pride of the Dominion, disabled in 11 seconds by a single vessel that had not even bothered to use what she would recognize as weapons. It was not a battle. It was a correction, the way a parent might gently take a dangerous object from a child's hand. "Admiral," her communications officer said, voice shaking, "we are receiving a transmission from the human vessel. Put it through." Kale's voice filled the dark bridge, calm, steady, and genuinely sorry. "Admiral Koth, your ships are intact, and your crews are unharmed. Can be restored by reconnecting the main conduits at junction points 7 through 12 on each vessel. I am transmitting repair instructions now. I told you I did not want to fight, and I meant it." The channel closed. Within hours, the footage leaked. Sensor recordings from a dozen nearby civilian vessels that had witnessed the engagement spread across the galactic communication networks at the speed of light. And the galaxy erupted. A single human in a single ship, had neutralized the Karathi Dominion's finest battle fleet without killing a single person. The implications hit every government, every military, every intelligence agency in known space like a shockwave. The Galactic Assembly convened an emergency session within a day. The great circular chamber on Nexus Station filled with representatives from every major and minor species. All of them talking over each other in a chaos of languages and translation algorithms. Instantly, the Velshara wanted the ships seized for scientific study. The Drenathai wanted an alliance with whoever controlled it. The Karathi demanded that the vessel be classified as a galactic threat and destroyed, and a dozen smaller species saw an opportunity to shift the balance of power in their favor. The Terran Republic's ambassador, a woman named Lena Vasek, sat in stunned silence as the galaxy argued about one of her citizens. Her government had not authorized this, had not planned for this, had not even known it was possible. And now she was fielding messages from the Terran president, demanding answers she did not have. In the middle of the chaos, a transmission arrived from the Varith Ascendant. Kale's voice, broadcast on an open channel that every delegate could hear. "My name is Kale Morrow. I am a human engineer. I did not seek this ship. I did not seek this power, and I am not interested in conquest or threats or politics. 12 hours ago, 40 warships tried to take this vessel by force, and I disabled all of them without causing a single injury. I did not start that fight. I ended it, peacefully. That should tell you everything you need to know about my intentions." The chamber fell silent, not because the words were particularly eloquent, but because they were simple and they were true. And sometimes that was enough to make an entire galaxy pause. But later, in the quiet of the ship, Athon spoke to Kale in a tone that carried no triumph, only worry. You handled that well, but we have a larger problem. The ship's reactivation sent a signal, not through normal space, but through the deep layers of dimensional fabric. It was a beacon, and something has heard it. What kind of something? The reason the Alar went to sleep, the reason we sealed ourselves away and let the galaxy forget us. There is an enemy, Kale, older than my people, older than the stars themselves, waiting in the spaces between dimensions for exactly this kind of signal. Kale felt a cold thread of fear wind through his new senses. And far away, at the very edge of the galaxy, where the stars thinned into nothing, and the void stretched infinite and black, something that had been sleeping for longer than worlds had existed began to stir. It had no eyes, but it turned its attention toward the light of the galaxy, and it was hungry. In the weeks that followed, Kale learned what it truly meant to be bonded with the most advanced vessel in the history of the galaxy. And the truth was that most of it felt like homework. Athon was a patient teacher, but a thorough one, and every day brought new systems to understand, new capabilities to test, new layers of technology so advanced that Kale's engineering training could barely keep up. The Vareth Ascendant could manipulate gravity the way a potter shaped clay, bending it and folding it to create pockets of compressed or expanded space. It could fold the fabric of reality itself to cross the width of the galaxy in the time it took Kale to take a breath. It could manufacture complex machines from raw matter, pulling atoms apart and reassembling them into anything from repair drones to sensor arrays. And it could heal itself from damage that would have turned any other ship into scrap, its living hull regrowing and reforming like a wound closing on living flesh. Skim. But it was the memory archives that changed everything. Athon had not merely lived for over 1,000,000 years. He had recorded those years, every moment, every sensation, every thought, stored in crystalline lattices that held information with a density that made the best Terran data systems look like cave paintings. And he offered those memories to Kale, not as data to be read, but as experiences to be lived. You need to understand what we face, Athon said. Words are not enough. You must see. Kale agreed, and the ship opened its archives, and Kale fell into the past. He saw the Alar at their height, a species of engineers and philosophers and dreamers who had mastered the fundamental forces of the universe the way humans had mastered fire. They reshaped stars, adjusting their burn rates to extend the lives of solar systems by billions of years. They seeded barren worlds with life, crafting ecosystems from scratch with the patience and precision of artists. They built structures that spanned light years, communication networks that operated outside of normal space, ships that were alive and thought and felt. They were magnificent, and Kale felt a deep kinship with them, because at their core, they were what he was: engineers, builders, fixers, people who looked at the universe and saw not something to conquer, but something to improve. And then he saw the Hollows arrive. They came from nowhere, or rather, they came from the spaces between dimensions, the thin, dark gaps between the layers of reality where nothing was supposed to exist. They were not creatures in any way that Kale could understand. They had no bodies, no ships, no technology. They were patterns, self-propagating equations of annihilation that moved through reality like a virus moved through a body. And everything they touched was not destroyed, but erased, not just physically, but informationally. When the Hollows consumed a world, that world did not explode or crumble or burn. It simply ceased to have ever existed. History rewrote itself around the gap. Memories faded, records vanished. The only evidence that anything had been lost was a strange hollow feeling in the minds of those who had been close to what was taken. A sense that something was missing without any ability to identify what. The war lasted 80,000 years. Kale lived through compressed memories of battles that defied description. Alar war minds fighting in dimensions that human language had no words for, wrestling with an enemy that existed as pure concept, that could not be shot or bombed or contained by any conventional means. And slowly, painfully, at a cost that made Kale weep inside the memory, the Alar found a way. They built a barrier between dimensions, a wall woven from the fabric of reality itself, anchored by a network of stations hidden across the galaxy, and they sealed the hollows behind it. Was everything. Their civilization was broken, their numbers reduced to a handful, their spirits shattered by 80 millennia of fighting an enemy that erased not just lives, but the memory of lives. The survivors looked at each other and at the galaxy they had saved and made a decision. They would upload themselves into their ships, go dormant, and become silent guardians of the barrier, sleeping through the ages and waiting for the day they might be needed again. Kale came out of the memories gasping, tears on his face, sitting on the floor of the central chamber, with the liquid light tesseract spinning slowly above him. He felt as though he had lived 1,000 lifetimes in the space of hours, and the weight of what the Alar had sacrificed pressed down on him like gravity. "The barrier is failing," Athon said quietly. 1.2 million years of entropy. The anchor stations are degrading, losing power, breaking down. The hollows have been pushing against the barrier. Barrier for all that time. Testing it, probing for weaknesses, and now the signal from our reactivation has shown them exactly where to look. How long do we have? Weeks, perhaps days. The first breaches will be small, testing incursions, but they will grow. The first incursion came 3 days later. A Velshara colony on a moon called Tessera Prime simply vanished. Not destroyed, not attacked, vanished. Ships that were on approach to the moon dropped out of faster-than-light travel and found nothing. Empty space where a moon with 3 million inhabitants had been. Sensors showed nothing. Records showed nothing. And when investigators searched the Velshara databases, they found that all information about Tessera Prime was gone. Birth records, immigration files, trade manifests, all of it erased, as though the moon and everyone on it had never existed. The only reason anyone knew something had happened was that the ships in transit had been outside the zone of erasure, and their crews remembered a destination that no longer existed. They arrived at coordinates that should have held a world, and found only the cold dark of empty space. And the horror of that discovery spread through the galaxy like poison. 2 more colonies vanished within the week. A Drenathi mining outpost, and a small Karathi military station. Each one erased so completely that only those who had been traveling to them at the time knew they had ever been real. Panic took hold. The Galactic Assembly descended into chaos. Accusations flew between species, each suspecting the others of deploying some secret weapon. And Kale watched from the Verith Ascendant, and knew that the real enemy had not even begun to fight. He also knew something that changed the shape of everything. He knew why humans mattered. The hollows attack through psionic resonance, Athon explained. Their primary weapon is not physical force, but informational. Erasure. They reach into the minds of living beings and delete them from reality, but this requires a connection, a frequency to lock onto. Every species in this galaxy has psionic resonance, which means every species is vulnerable, except one. Humans, Kale said, humans, your psychic nullity, a very trait that every other species has pitied or dismissed, is perfect immunity to the Hollow's primary weapon. They cannot erase what they cannot perceive. A human standing in the path of a Hollow incursion would see it clearly, while every other species would be blinded, confused, and vulnerable. Your people are not the weakest species in this galaxy, Kale. They may be the most important. Kale sat with that knowledge for a long time, and then he began making calls. He went to the Karathi first. he appeared in person aboard a shuttle at the Dominion's capital, requesting an audience with Admiral Saivara Koth, the same admiral whose fleet he had humbled. Weeks ago, he brought no weapons, no threats, no demands. He brought the Alar's memory archives, compressed into a format that Karathi systems could read, and he laid them before her like an offering. Saivara watched the records in silence. The rise of the Alar, the horror of the Hollows, the 80,000-year war, the failing barrier. And when it was over, she looked at Kale with eyes that had changed. The contempt was gone, replaced by something harder and more honest. "Why come to me?" she asked. "I tried to take your ship by force." "Because you are the best military commander in the galaxy," Kale said simply. "And because you did your duty as you understood it. I cannot fight what is coming alone, and I cannot fight it with people I do not respect. I respect you, Admiral." Saivara was quiet for a long moment. "What do you need?" "Everything. Every ship, every soldier, every resource the Dominion can spare. The rest of the galaxy to do the same." The Terran Republic came next. Kale spoke to the President directly, explaining what was at stake and what humanity's role would be. The President, a practical woman named Chen Wei, listened without interruption and then asked one question. "Are you telling me that our people are the only ones who can see this enemy?" "Yes." "Then we do not have a choice, do we?" "No, ma'am, we do not." The galaxy began to mobilize. Slowly at first, grudgingly, with old rivalries and suspicions making every negotiation a battle in itself. But the Hollows kept coming, kept erasing, and fear is a powerful motivator when the thing you fear makes worlds disappear. And then the barrier broke. Not a crack, not a leak, but a catastrophic rupture. A wave of unreality swept outward from the breach, like a tide of nothing, moving toward the galactic core at the speed of thought. And in its path, star systems began to go dark, exploding, not collapsing, just ceasing to be. Light that had traveled for thousands of years simply stopped arriving, because the stars that had produced it no longer existed and never had. Kale stood on the bridge of the Varith Ascendant, felt the wave coming through his expanded senses like a wall of silence rushing toward everything he had ever known. And he understood that the time for preparation was over. The time for engineering had begun. The combined fleet of every spacefaring species in the galaxy gathered at the edge of the approaching wave of erasure, and it was the largest military force ever assembled in recorded history. Karathi dreadnoughts flying in formation alongside Velshara science vessels, Drenathi heavy cruisers flanking nimble Terran frigates, and 100 smaller species contributing whatever they could. Cargo ships retrofitted with weapons, civilian transports packed with volunteers, mining vessels whose crews had decided that if the universe was ending, they would rather face it than run. Admiral Saivara Koth coordinated the fleet from her flagship, her voice steady across 10,000 open channels, and at the center of the formation sat the Varith Ascendant like a dark heart among stars. But Kale was not thinking about the fleet. He was thinking about the problem, and the problem was not a military one. "We cannot fight the Hollows with weapons," he told the assembled commanders in a briefing that he knew would be difficult. "They are not a fleet to be destroyed or an army to be defeated. They are a pattern, a process, a wave of erasure, moving through the dimensional fabric. Shooting at them would be like shooting at a storm. You might scatter the rain, but the wind would still tear you apart." "Then what do you suggest?" Saivara asked, and to her credit there was no frustration in her voice, only the sharp focus of a strategist adjusting to new information. "I suggest we do what I have always done," Kale said. "I suggest we fix what is broken. The Hollows are coming through because the dimensional barrier has failed. If we repair the barrier, we seal them back where they came from, permanently. And how exactly does one repair a dimensional barrier built by a civilization that has been extinct for over 1,000,000 years?" Kale smiled, the tired, crooked smile of a man who had spent his life fixing things that other people said, could not be fixed, one piece at a time. The plan was simple in concept and nearly impossible in execution. The Varith Ascendant would serve as the primary tool, using its reality manipulation capabilities to literally rebuild the dimensional barrier from the inside. But to do that, Kale would have to take the ship into the barrier itself, into the space between dimensions where physics operated on suggestions rather than laws, and work from within, while the Hollows fought to stop him. The fleet's job was to buy time, to hold the line at the edge of the wave and slow its advance long enough for Kale to complete the repair, and this was where humanity's role became critical. The Hollows attacked perception. They reached into minds through psionic resonance and erased awareness, making entire fleets forget what they were fighting or why they were there. Karathi captains would suddenly find themselves unable to remember their orders. Velshara navigators would lose track of their coordinates. Drenathi gunners would forget which direction to fire. But human crew members, psychically null, immune to the Hollow's primary weapon, could see clearly through the confusion. Every ship in the Allied fleet received a contingent of human volunteers, soldiers, engineers, even civilians who had stepped forward, knowing the risk. Their job was simple and vital. When the Hollows clouded the minds of alien crews, the humans would be there to say, "The enemy is that way, fire now, hold this position, do not forget why you are here." They became the eyes and the memory of the entire galactic fleet, the one thread of clarity in a storm of erasure. Kale watched the human volunteers boarding alien warships, saw the Karathi warriors looking at the small, soft, psionic null creatures with something that was no longer contempt, but something close to awe. And he felt a fierce pride that burned in his chest like a reactor core. The Varith Ascendant into the barrier. The space between dimensions was not a place in any meaningful sense. It was a gap, a nothing, a space where the rules that governed reality thinned to almost nothing. Up and down had no meaning. Time moved in spirals rather than lines, and the geometry of the space shifted constantly, like the inside of a kaleidoscope designed by a madman. Kale felt his human brain struggling to process what his ship's senses were showing him, and he gritted his teeth and forced himself to focus the way he had always focused. On the work, on the next task, on the bolt in front of him. The barrier was visible here, or rather, it was feelable, a vast membrane that separated the dimensions, stretched thin and torn in 1,000 places. The Hollows poured through the tears, like dark water through a broken dam, formless and hungry, and they turned their attention to the Varith Ascendant immediately. They could not erase Kale. His psychic nullity protected him, but they could attack the ship itself, tearing at its hull with forces that existed outside normal physics. Athon fought back, the ship's ancient weapons blazing in colors that had no names. But for every hollow they pushed back, 10 more pressed forward. "Work faster," Athon urged, strain evident in the ancient voice for the first time. Kale worked. He did not fight the Hollows. That was not his job. His job was to find the broken places in the barrier and fix them. And he did it the same way he had fixed broken ships in the scrapyard, by understanding the system, finding the stress points, and applying solutions with precision and patience. The barrier was not so different from a hull breach when he looked at it with an engineer's eyes. There were structural principles, load-bearing elements, points where the fabric of reality could be reinforced and sealed. And the Varith Ascendant's tools, incomprehensibly advanced as they were, responded to his intuition like the finest instruments he had ever held. One tier at a time, one seal at a time, one repair at a time. Methodical, grinding, unglamorous work. The kind of work that would never make a good story, because it involved no dramatic sword fights or clever speeches. Just a man, his ship, and his stubborn refusal to stop working until the job was done. In the middle of the repair, the Hollow Sovereign found him. It was the core intelligence of the swarm, if intelligence was even the right word. a vast cold pattern that pressed against Kale's mind, and finding no psionic frequency to exploit, simply spoke to him in concepts that his brain translated into words. You are small. You are nothing. Your species is a footnote in a galaxy that will not remember you. Why do you struggle for creatures who have spent centuries looking down on you? Let us through, and we will pass over your kind. You are too insignificant to erase. Kale paused in his work, not because the words hurt, though they did, but because he genuinely considered the offer for one honest moment, and then he shook his head. You know what the problem is with being an engineer, he said to the vast and ancient thing that wanted to eat the universe. You develop this annoying habit of not being able to walk away from a broken system, even when the system has been unfair to you, even when the people who use the system have treated you badly, even when it would be easier and safer to just let it fall apart. You see something broken, and some part of your brain just will not let you leave it that way. He turned back to the barrier and kept working. I am not doing this because the galaxy deserves it, he said, as he sealed another tear. I am doing it because it is broken and I can fix it, and that is what I do. The Hollow Sovereign had no response to that. It was an equation, a pattern, a process, and it had no framework for understanding someone who chose to act not from self-interest or power or fear, but from the simple, stubborn compulsion to make things work. The repair was nearly complete when Athon spoke, and his voice was different, softer, older, carrying the weight of acceptance. Kale, the barrier requires a permanent anchor, a consciousness embedded in its structure to maintain it indefinitely. Without one, the repair will degrade within centuries, and we will face this threat again. Kale felt ice in his veins. No, I have been alone for 1.2 million years. I have drifted and slept and waited and hoped, and today I finally found what I was waiting for. Not a pilot, not a weapon, not a warrior, a purpose. Let me have this, Kale. Let me be what I was always meant to be. Athon, there has to be another way. I can engineer something, a power source, an automated system. You are the finest engineer I have ever known, and you know that some repairs require a part of yourself. You taught me that. Every time you talked about the ships you fixed in the scrapyard, the ones where you had to cut a piece from your own hull plating because you had nothing else. This is my hull plating, Kale. This is my piece. Kale wanted to argue. He wanted to rage and refuse and find another solution. But he was an engineer, and engineers understood sacrifice, understood that sometimes the only thing that fit the gap was something you were not ready to give up. You were my friend, Kale said, and his voice broke on the word. And you were mine, the first in over 1,000,000 years. Build well, engineer. Athon's consciousness flowed out of the ship and into the barrier, like light pouring into a dark room. The ancient Alar mind spread across the dimensional membrane, filling every crack, reinforcing every weak point, weaving itself into the fabric so completely that the barrier did not just hold. It blazed with new strength, brighter and more solid than it had been even when the Alar first built it. The hollows screamed, a sound that existed in no physical spectrum, but that Kale felt in his soul, and they were pushed back, all of them, swept behind the barrier like debris before a flood. And the membrane sealed shut with a finality that echoed across dimensions. In normal space, the wave of erasure stopped, hung motionless for one terrible breathless moment, and then receded, pulling back like a tide going out. And in its wake, impossibly, beautifully, the stars that had been erased flickered back into existence. Not all of them, and not all at once, but enough. Enough to make every being in the galaxy look up and feel something that none of them had words for. The fleet erupted in chaos, in joy, in relief, in the raw primal celebration of beings who had stared into the void and found that the void had blinked first. Karathi warriors roared and pounded their consoles. Velshara scientists wept openly. Drenathi crews embraced each other with all 4 arms, and on every ship the human volunteers stood quiet and steady, smiling small smiles, because the job was done, and that was enough. Kale brought the Varith Ascendant home, though home was a word that had changed meaning for him. The ship was quiet now, truly quiet, without Athon's vast presence filling its corridors. It was still the most powerful vessel in the galaxy, still alive in its own way, but it felt like a house where someone beloved had recently moved out. All the furniture was there, but the warmth was different. At the Galactic Assembly, Kale spoke briefly. He did not give a grand speech because he was not a politician, and did not pretend to be. He simply said that the threat was over, that the barrier was repaired, and that he would be available if anyone needed help with anything. The galaxy's perception of humanity shifted that day in a way that no war or roar, treaty or diplomatic maneuver could have achieved. They were no longer the young species, the minor species, the forgettable species. They were the builders, the fixers, the ones who stayed when everyone else ran, and every species in the galaxy knew that when the end came, it was a human engineer who had held reality together, with nothing but stubbornness and a refusal to leave broken things broken. Admiral Saivara found Kale afterward, standing alone on an observation deck, looking out at the stars. She stood beside him in silence for a while, and then she said, "The Karathi have a saying, 'Fear the warrior who has nothing to prove.' I never understood it until I met you." "I am not a warrior," Kale said. "No," Saivara agreed. "You are something more dangerous. You are competent." That surprised a laugh out of him, the first real laugh in a long time. And Saivara allowed herself a thin, sharp-toothed smile before walking away. Later, alone, returned to the Varith Ascendant's central chamber. The pedestal was dark, the liquid-light tesseract was gone, and the room that had once blazed with impossible colors was quiet and still. He placed his hand on the cold surface of the pedestal and closed his eyes. For a moment, just a moment, he felt a warmth beneath his palm, and a whisper at the very edge of awareness, so faint it might have been imagination. "Build well, engineer." Kale opened his eyes, pulled his toolkit from his belt, and looked around the chamber with the appraising gaze of a man who saw not an empty room, but a project. There was work to do. There was always work to do. A ship to maintain, a galaxy to help rebuild, and a legacy to honor. He knelt beside the nearest power conduit, opened his toolkit, and got to work.